Well, thank you for joining us for our final session of the day. The fact that we still have 61 people in the audience is a really good sign. I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Msia Kibona Clark here with us today to present Engaging with Contemporary African Music. Dr. Kibona's work explores the role of cultural representations in presenting narratives that shape identities and perceptions around race, gender, and sexuality. Her work also explores African feminist activism and cyber activism in digital and social media spaces. She's published 4 books: Hip Hop in Africa, Prophets of the City and Dusty Foot Philosophers, African Women in Digital Spaces, Redefining Social Movements on the Continent and in the Diaspora, Hip Hop and Social Change in Africa and Miwakati, and Pan-African Spaces, essays on Black transnationalism. She teaches courses including Black Women in Popular Culture at Howard University and Hip Hop and Social Change in Africa. Along with students in the Hip Hop in Africa course, she produces the Hip Hop African blog hosted at hiphopafrican.com. Dr. Kibona, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. So in doing preparing the presentation, actually finished working on it this morning. So I'm going to upload the PowerPoint. The file size was too big. So I'm actually uploading the PDF of the PowerPoint because I wasn't able to get it to the organizers in time. But I'm also uploading a syllabus that I put together. This was about, I guess, 2 years ago. It's kind of an introduction to hip hop class, introduction to hip hop syllabus that was published in a special issue of a hip hop journal for the Words, Beats, and Life hip hop journal. And I figured I would, share that. But the PDF of the PowerPoint, and I'll just kind of go through it. But so yeah, my work focuses on hip hop in Africa. And I always like to say from the outset that especially now with the popularity of Afro beats, that I have to kind of say that Afro beats is not hip hop, that I know, and is, I can kind of talk about it a bit, but a lot of it has to do with the way Afro beats was initially marketed to the US, and it was kind of marketed as African hip hop. And there's a lot of overlap. It was also influenced by hip hop, and there are artists that kind of do both. And so there has been a lot of assumption, but there is a really thriving hip hop scene throughout much of Africa. Not every single country, but there are really some strong hip hop scenes. And so I want to kind of talk about what's happening there and kind of how looking at hip hop in Africa allows us to also get a look at alternative narratives to African culture, to kind of different perspectives on politics in Africa, gender in Africa, sexuality, conversations around sexuality, conversations around immigration. And so looking at how incorporating also a culture that youth students are already so engaged in. And there's also quite a bit that's been done regarding hip hop and education. In fact, there's a hip hop ed conference happening on the 22nd in New York. It happens every year. It focuses on US hip hop, but again, the hip hop education movement is, has been around in the US for a very long time. But my work is focusing on Africa. And I also want to start with a quote by Chuck D, who, I know some of you will know who Chuck D is, and I sometimes will say this quote, and my students have no idea who I'm talking about. But, and it hurts my heart that they don't know who he is. But Chuck D recently said, "The future of hip hop and rap music is Africa. All 54 nations, a super rapper, which is a term he coined, is somebody that got 4 languages in their pocket, could spit at you in 4 languages and braid them, and then in South Africa still do the click. How is that not a super rapper? How is that not a super MC?" And so this was during an interview he did for Sway, a popular radio show. And in this, he's looking at the fact that much of the innovation is happening in hip hop culture is happening outside of the United States. In this particular case, he's looking at Africa, and the fact that most African hip hop artists are multilingual. And so this idea that most artists are rapping in multiple languages, and he talks about in South Africa, they got the click, but this idea that they're weaving languages, and sometimes in one verse, they'll use 3 and 4 languages to get a message across. And he just found that really fascinating and really amazing. And, you know, in his mind, thought that, you know, Chuck D being really one of the more respected artists in hip hop, he's, you know, built up a lot of credibility. And so for him saying it is definitely different than me saying it. Me saying it, I have zero credibility in hip hop culture. Chuck D has a lot of credibility in hip hop culture, which is why I think when he said it, a lot of artists in Africa were very excited and happy because it felt like some kind of validation. Because for many, there was this idea that the music that they were doing, they were influenced by the hip hop in the US. So late 80s, early 90s, youth in urban Africa were hearing the songs and music coming out of New York City, and they were identifying with it. They were identifying with the conditions in urban areas, the overcrowdedness, the poor schools, the poor infrastructure, police violence, even though it looked a little bit different, except in South Africa. South Africa looked very much the same. They were, you know, dealing with issues of issues in terms of poor health conditions. They were hearing these things and were identifying with them. And so it's one of the reasons why hip hop throughout Africa started out in the cities and pretty much remained in the cities. It's a very urban culture, not only in the US, but also throughout Africa. Wherever you find hip hop, it's primarily in the urban areas because those were the communities that identified with it. And so as youth in Africa are, you know, embracing the music, they're making it their own, they're talking about their own realities. Artists in the US, hip hop communities in the US were not recognizing or respecting what the artists in Africa were doing. And so for Chuck D to acknowledge that not only what they were doing was legit hip hop, that what they were doing was actually something that was innovative, something that they weren't doing in the US. And so that was really a groundbreaking moment. And this was something that he said, I think last year or the year, this was within around the 50th anniversary of hip hop. So this was, I believe, last year when he said that. So it was, you know, really kind of amazing. So, you know, rewinding a bit and looking at this idea of the connection between hip hop in the US and hip hop on the continent, the connection between music in the diaspora and music on the continent of Africa is not new. I mean, it didn't kind of emerge with hip hop. It's not like hip hop started out in the South Bronx in 1973 and then went to Africa in the 1980s. And that was kind of that first contact. The connection between African American communities and other diaspora communities, also, you know, you look at the Caribbean as well as Africa, goes way back. And if you look at the idea that many of the enslaved Africans who were taken from West Africa and brought to the Americas, brought to the Caribbean, took with them certain tools that would eventually become hip hop. So when you look at African drumming, the idea of the talking drum, when you look at early hip hop drum beats, they're very similar drum patterns to African drum beats. When you look at the role of the rapper, they play a very similar role in the role of the griot or their storyteller and their creative embellishment, the story, kind of relating the story of the community. Mos Def, which is, you know, who's a famous rapper, a US rapper, said, if you want to know what's happening in the ghetto, listen to hip hop. And Chuck D once called hip hop the ghetto CNN. So this idea that the MC is telling you what's happening. traditional rhyming. In Senegal, there's a form of traditional rhyming called tasu, and the Senegalese swear that that is hip hop, that that's rapping, that tasu is the origins of rapping. I haven't seen any, research evidence of that, but fine. I will let the Senegalese have that. But tasu does sound very similar to rapping. And then you have this idea of collaborative music, this idea that within traditional Africa, you have people, communities coming together, that it's not just me coming to perform for you, but it's us performing together. You come bring your instruments, I bring mine, the community gets involved, call and response. If you've been to a hip hop concert, there's a lot of call and response. There's a lot of engagement with the audience. There's a lot of people, calling out, whether it's, the guys say this, the women say that, or if you're from this area, say this, or if you're representing this or that. And that kind of collaborative energy is also something that we find. So you've always had these connections. You've always had this back and forth between the US and different African countries. When you look at Fela Kuti and Afrobeat music, there's a lot of influence from funk music from LA. LA funk influenced Afrobeat. And no one would say Afrobeat is not African just because it was influenced by funk. When you look at the Cape Town jazz scene, Cape Town jazz was definitely influenced by US jazz. So, you look at this kind of back and forth that's been happening, the African influence on US music and vice versa. So when we kind of look more contemporarily, you look at the early 2000s, the emergence of African MCs in the US. You have also kind of looking at the UK, which honestly, forms this very interesting role in this kind of, when you look at hip hop, you look at, throughout Africa, and then you look at the US, and then you look at Europe. I'm focusing on the UK, quite honestly, because I don't speak French, I don't speak Portuguese. So I know that there are large hip hop scenes in Portugal and in France and many other European countries. My research has focused on England simply because of language, accessibility. So, but when we look at, so if we're going to look at Europe, Africa, and the US, we would see a very interesting trend happening. You see, for example, the UK grime scene very much influenced by US hip hop influencing UK hip hop, UK hip hop influencing Nigerian hip hop, Ghanaian hip hop. You also see drill music, which came about a little bit later, kind of emerging in New York and in Chicago, moving into London, creating the London drill scene. That scene moving into Kenya and into Ghana, and specifically in Ghana into Kumasi, and you have the emergence of the Kumasi drill scene, and Kumasi being renamed Kumerica, because it is the home of this huge drill music scene. Again, so this really interesting way that the music is traveling. So I think it's been really fascinating to see. Within all of this, people are telling their stories. It's like people are understanding the assignment. So even when you look at gangster rap and the popularity of that in the US, and you see it emerge in Cape Town, it emerges in Cape Town because Cape Town also had an issue with gang violence. So it wasn't just, there are, of course, were people who were pretending. I mean, there are people who were pretending in the US, but there was a legitimate gang violence issue happening in Cape Town, and many artists in Cape Town comparing Cape Town to Compton in terms of the level of gang violence and drug activity and single parents and all of these things. So interestingly, in terms of looking at all of these parallels, again, being able to point to this cycle of kind of exchange and back and forth and all of these things. So you have in the late 2000s, a lot of this stuff really being facilitated by social media, the kind of improvement of social media throughout Africa. I mentioned the drill scene, really the late 2000s, that kind of really emerging. But the spread of hip hop throughout Africa, I really can't overstate the role that social media played, because prior to that, prior to kind of like the spread of social media, I remember MySpace. You could, go on MySpace, but I had to know where to go on MySpace. I had to know, who am I looking for? There wasn't a page for Ghanaian hip hop on MySpace. I had to know who the artist was. So that was kind of like the early iterations. Before that, in order to know what was happening with Ghanaian hip hop, I had to go to Ghana. Around 2010, 2011, you start seeing far more artists kind of coming on to spaces like Facebook, and then eventually, of course, Instagram and Twitter. Reverb Nation was also a website. A lot of people hosted their music. Now you're seeing a lot of artists having their stuff on Spotify and Apple Music. So now I can find out, and like podcasting, that's taken off as well. There's an African hip hop playlist on Apple Music. Like, that did not exist in 2010. And even though there was a lot of hip hop happening, it didn't exist. So now when I'm teaching my class, I'm able to point students to resources, and I'm able to say, so with my hip hop in Africa class, with the blog, every student adopts a country. They all pick a country, and they have to blog about a hip hop song from that country every other week. And they, there are plenty of places where they can find the music. So they go online, they find the music, and they, their assignment is to do a 300-word post. If you don't like the song, you can say you don't like the song. You can understand that it's public. So there are times the students have, criticized artists. And there have been, one or two times the artist didn't particularly like the criticism. And, we had one case where the artists and their fans decided to drag us on social media. And I kind of had to jump in and say, hey, you students, this is a student project. One, if you're an artist, you need to be able to take criticism, but you also need to calm down. But for the most part, artists will share it. Our posts have showed up on people's websites. It showed up on people, on Wikipedia. This is for usually lesser known artists. For bigger artists, no, but for lesser known artists. And so it engages our students in conversation. So their posts are public. And I'm like, I want you to be part of this conversation. You're a hip hop fan. You listen to hip hop, hip hop, and certain aspects of hip hop more than I do. And so you have just as much of a right to have an opinion about this music as I do. So what is your opinion? And 300 words or more. And so it gets them really engaged in it, and it's fun. Their final project is they have to do either a podcast or put together a mixtape. And this past year, one of the students did a podcast, a post on she's Ethiopian American artist, and the artist really appreciated it. And so the student was like, I really want to interview her for the podcast. And I said, well, you guys have communicated. If she agrees, the artist agreed, and her podcast was an interview with this artist. And that podcast got, we published it. And so it then became the student's project, but it was also press for the artist. So it served these multiple purposes. And that's one of the things with the posts. The students have to include photos and links, because we want to make sure these artists are also getting recognition, that if people like their music, they can find it. So we want to also kind of lift up these artists and not just kind of sit and talk about them, so that your work has a greater purpose. And as myself and the TA, we usually will go through the posts and kind of just, make sure, because artists, I mean, the students, many of them don't know a lot about Africa. And so some of the stuff we have to kind of go through. Sometimes a few students can be a bit patronizing. And it's like, wait, you're talking about an artist who's been around for 20 years and you're telling them do better next time. Like it's sometimes we have to like step in. But for the most part, the students are, you know, pretty much do pretty good work. And so really since the explosion of Afrobeats, we've had a lot more attention, a lot more students understanding and knowing about Africa, and not just Afrobeats, but Nollywood and the popularity of African fashion and all of these things, Black Panther, the Black is King Project, the Year of Return, all of these things have made Afrochella and Ghana's Dirty December, and like now the students are like, you know, coming in telling me stuff about kind of what's happening. And so that's been really interesting. And so looking at the way the elements of hip hop have shown up, so you know, they're the different the DJ, so DJ culture has shown up throughout the continent, but you've also had street art and graffiti. So this last semester, we actually interviewed a graffiti artist from South Africa named Breeze Yoko, and just really amazingly talented artist. So we've also seen kind of street art, also street artists, graffiti artists, also in communication. Senegal has I don't know if it's every year, every other year, a graffiti festival called Festagraph, and it stands for Festival Graffiti. You know, they speak French, so I'm not sure. I know it's Festagraph. It's called Festagraph, and it is it's every year, every other. I know they just had it, but it's the largest graffiti festival in Africa, and it brings people from all over the world. And so, you know, that's one of the ways that hip hop engages the world in Senegal. You also have breakdance. I, you know, was curious to find out how many African dancers were going to be in the Olympics. You know, a lot of people have been asking whether or not, you know, is that appropriation? Is that okay? Like what's happening? I don't know. There aren't many African dancers, and from what I understand, that dancers have to find sponsors. Like governments aren't sponsoring breakdance teams to go to the Olympics. Dancers have to find sponsors. And this is the first year, there really aren't sponsors. So people, you know, if you're coming from, you know, Nigeria, you're a young kid who's a breakdancer, you may not be able to find sponsorship. And so some of the best dancers aren't going to be able to be there. And so it's going to be mostly the ones coming from the global north. And I think I've heard a few African dancers who are affiliated with the global north are finding sponsors, but I don't know, but there's a huge breakdance scene. Uganda probably has one of the most unique breakdance scenes. They have, and many in that community will tell you that they have indigenized breakdancing and have a very unique Ugandan form of breakdance. But I think that's really cool. So, but again, looking at dance, but also in terms of kind of going back to the rapping, looking at hip hop and social commentary and looking at the way that artists are engaging. So whether we are talking about the graffiti, the breakdance, the rapping, even the DJing, people are engaging in social commentary. So for example, with the graffiti, we know with street art, and during the Arab Spring in Egypt and in Tunisia, people posted a lot of revolutionary messages. They're all gone. They've all been painted over, but there were a lot of really revolutionary messages that were painted. And so street artists have always kind of put messages on walls. But a lot of artists will, you know, kind of put music out there. They will talk about corruption, talk about gender-based violence, immigration. You know, one of the most dangerous migration routes in the world is across the Sahara Desert. One of the others is across the sea, going from North Africa into Europe. So a lot of artists will talk about that. Conflicts, various, you know, conflicts in Africa, people will talk about that. You also have had artists that have physically been involved in protests. And so you had the Yanamar movement in Senegal, which was, really influential in getting the previous president voted out of office. But many of those same artists were influential in pushing the most recent president in Senegal to finally kind of concede to elections. I mean, it was a bit of a mess, but it was artists, were involved in kind of that push. They weren't the only factor, but in Nigeria with the NSARS movement, you had artists like Falls the Bad Guy, who in the PDF you'll see like a little like a image of the This Is Nigeria. So you can find that on YouTube. And that song was banned in Nigeria at one point. So that was based off of This Is America by Childish Gambino. And so that was This Is Nigeria. And so I often will play that for students because they know This Is America and they understood that it was talking about a lot of social issues here. This Is Nigeria talks about social issues there. And so what these artists are doing is they're giving different perspectives on social issues and often offering new and counter narratives. So in many cases, they will, challenge some of the dominant Western narratives that are out there about Africans, about specifically African women. The idea of, who African women are often challenged by African women artists. The idea that African women are docile and meek and submissive. And, many African women MCs will immediately kind of like challenge that. But also kind of looking at gender and sexuality and how there aren't a lot of queer artists. I mean, there's still some laws that need to be changed throughout Africa, but you have places like South Africa where you have not only artists that are gay and lesbian, but you have artists that are non-binary, you have artists that are on various levels parts of the spectrum. So South Africa probably has one of the most diverse in terms of sexuality and gender identity hip-hop scenes. And then you've got lots of ways that women are expressing themselves and talking about gender-based violence. South Africa, because of the high rates of gender-based violence, you hear about it more in South Africa than you do in any other country, but it's still, kind of really, really something that's talked about throughout the continent. All right, so in terms of in terms of resources, one of the things that, and I wish I could kind of take complete credit for coming up with all the lesson plans. When I started teaching the course on hip hop in Africa, it was 2016. And I went online and I'm like Googling, because I love podcasts. I listen to podcasts. And so I started Googling podcasts in the classroom and found, a bunch of resources. I Googled, music and lesson plans, and found some, a lot of ways where you can like look at videos, especially made by women, specifically made by African women artists, and look at the way that those videos and those songs challenge stereotypes of African women. So we can look at them and say, what are the stereotypes of African women? That they're poor, that they're begging, they have a lot of kids. How do these videos contradict or challenge our ideas of who African women are? And so wanting to kind of put something together, but then also looking at all of the stuff that's been published. There's a lot of stuff that's been published, but there are a lot of artists also. So, I wanted to do that. And then the last thing, I don't know if the people at the Center for African Studies at Howard even remember this, but back, I think in 2017, Brenda, Vanessa, you all funded me creating an online hip hop social change in Africa course. It initially went on to iTunes U. iTunes U closed down, and so we just put it on Udemy. And it just pretty much put it on there, and it's one of those self-run things. So no one is like actually, so I put the videos up, the lectures up, the lesson plans up. It's like about hours worth of different like short videos. And I checked, actually, because of this, I checked, and there's like 450 or so students who have registered for that course. So I thought, oh wow, that's really cool, because I haven't updated anything, which I kind of feel bad about, but it's a course on YouTube. So also on that PDF that I uploaded, you'll see the screenshot of that course as well as the link to that course. So there's also content there. And I really appreciate, the center. I don't that course kind of lives on. And, I think that was something that I really appreciate you all working with me to create. But yeah, so I'll stop there. It was about 30 minutes. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions in the chat box. I will start with the first one on the list. T. Clark writes, excited to hear about your thoughts on mainstream rap and the diasporic connections now with the rise of Afrobeat in the US.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely interesting. I do like that there are connections being made. I know, like, there was debate around Beyonce's connection with I think the Black is King project and other connections between mainstream artists. I think it's positive that those connections are being made. I think that sometimes the problem is when artists will come to, like, if a mainstream rapper comes to Nigeria and they say, hey, we want to connect with local rappers, they will connect them to a Wizkid or a Davido, who are Afrobeats artists, and not connect them to a Mode 9 or MI, who are rappers. And so what happens is the rap artists don't get the opportunity to collaborate because the industry in Nigeria is more invested in those Afrobeats artists. So I think that's sometimes the problem. But I think the idea of these artists collaborating is overall a good thing.
T. Clark also has some questions about the syllabus. They'd like to know who designed it and what are the graded assignments of the course. You also mentioned interviews and virtual connections. Do you do those during class, and what's the format?
So I designed. I use a template. So I think, was it Adobe Express? Yeah, I use their templates and kind of like drag and drop. So yeah, and I'm also I'm also a photographer. So I took all the pictures in the syllabus. And I'm also a podcast. So we have the Hip Hop African podcast, and the during COVID we started doing the podcast on Zoom. And when we were teaching on Zoom, we thought it would be nice to allow the students to record the Zoom interviews in the class, so students could also ask questions. And so that kind of got us into doing it that way. But a lot of it was looking at tutorials online, looking at other professors who had done it, a lot of people in media studies who had done it, and looking at how they came up with the rubric, how they came up with instructions. Because with undergraduates especially, and high school students, you really have to give them very, very detailed. You can't just say, do a podcast. It has to be so detailed. And so I kind of I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So I kind of went and looked at how other people, the instructions that they had laid out, and then just, copied and pasted and edited.
Great. Yeah, we put the link to the Hip Hop African blog and podcast in the chat, and we'll share that when we post the recordings as well. And don't forget to download the PDFs that were shared earlier with the syllabus and PowerPoint presentation. Are there any other questions?
Thank you for the information about the rapper from South Africa. I'm always on the lookout for artists. I'm actually going to be in South Africa this fall, so it would be
Great. Any other comments or questions from anyone watching? You can raise your hand or post in the chat box.
I do have a question.
Go ahead.
And well, I'm basically trying to find out what's your take as far as the political environment in terms of freedom of speech, United States versus maybe Nigeria or any other country in Africa. You talked about expression through graffiti and stuff like that. In Africa, I think the tolerance may not be in the Constitution, or perhaps it's in the Constitution, but the tolerance is very, very low. And in the United States, you would say the freedom of speech is somehow constitutionally guaranteed. So what is your take in terms of the difference, and how do the different environment will promote musical expressions to the extent that will get a lot of people involved?
So yeah, I mean, that's true. It definitely is different. I'm originally from Tanzania, and one of the things that I'm always, somewhat frustrated about is Tanzanian artists are they're just not as politically vocal. I mean, they will sometimes put stuff in the subtext, but they're not as vocal as Senegalese. Senegalese artists are much more vocal. And then you also have artists that have paid that price. I mean, in Angola, there's an artist that, was under house arrest and definitely paid the price in terms of his freedom. So you've got kind of these variations, and where you have traditions of protest. South Africa, I mean, every time I turn around, there's a protest or a strike or something in South Africa. So the artists there are also much more likely to speak out about stuff. So I think a lot does depend on where you are. I think that a lot of presidents and governments have learned lessons and have adjusted. So things like slowing down the internet or shutting down the internet, monitoring like WhatsApp, those things have they've used to kind of try to like get around some of that stuff. After Yanamar, when some of those artists and some of those activists went to the Congo to work with activists there, they went there under the guise of performing as artists. The government quickly found out, oh, these are the ones that were causing trouble in Senegal, and detained them, and they ended up getting kicked out of the Congo. So there are those things, Congo was a lot less tolerant. They weren't going to, so yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely, it's frustrating because there are those differences. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, like with Tanzania, I don't see things changing. Like, I don't know what it would take for there to even be a protest in Tanzania. Like, I don't know what it would take for there to even, like, for people to even, yeah. So yeah, sometimes I think there can be that level of frustration. But also I understand, the violence and the, detention, people being detained, people disappearing, that's very, very real.
Right. Thank you very much.
We have a question from Kameo. Kameo, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right, so great presentation. I want to just add, I'm a child of American hip hop, grew up with it since its inception. Do you think that there could be concern from some of these governmental actors about perhaps the negative parts of American hip hop going into, not so much the protest, which I appreciate, but I know in some travels I've done, especially on the continent, I see some of the things that I'm like, I wish they would not get that part of hip hop, but some of the things that I look at it, I'm like, it was never like this. It was more conscious when I was growing up, a lot less conscious now. So if you could speak to that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think with drill music, the drill scene in Ghana, you know, I don't listen to drill. I don't understand it. I literally, I've pressed play. I can't understand. I know they're speaking English, but I have no idea what they're saying. But I've heard, like, you know, I follow the media. Someone who grew up with hip hop, I remember when there was this blanket kind of categorization of anything with profanity as gangster rap. And then, you know, people like C. Dolores Tucker, like destroying hip hop CDs. And there wasn't any understanding of nuance. And I understand how I felt having to defend our music. So I try not to do that with drill, but it's really tough. And so now when I see that in Ghana, and I see these young guys in Ghana, and I'm like, I'm trying not to do that, but I'm also like, you know, I see them waving these red bandanas, bringing up imagery of, you know, gang culture. So, and then using the N-word with very little understanding of the history of it. So yeah, there's that. Yeah, there's definitely that frustration. Yeah, it's a very real frustration.
Thank you.
Any last questions? Any?
I have one question. If I could, thank you so much for your presentation. Very interesting. And for those of us who are not really so conversant with the topic, we're able to grasp it at least. So my question is really, you know, especially when you say you're from Tanzania, where probably most people are not studying hip hop. What led you to study that?
Oh, that's a great question. So, well, I'm Gen X. I'm Generation X. I grew up in hip hop. I always say Gen X contributed the best hip hop artists to hip hop. So when you think of Tupac and Biggie and all, like in Tanzania, my generation even we like mourned. I went to Tanzania soon after Biggie died, I believe, and it was like that was all people were talking about in my generation. So it was something that united Tupac and Biggie. I think united all kind of Gen Xers who were into hip hop. And so as I kind of, you know, went into my, you know, doctoral program, I was looking at other stuff, looking at immigration and all that. And scholarship began coming out, like hip hop studies in the US began to develop really the late 90s, early 2000s. I come through the PhD program mid 2000s, and stuff is starting to come out on Africa and specifically Tanzania because of Swahili and the, you know, use of Swahili in hip hop. And friends of mine who are artists were, you know, contacting me furious about what was being written about hip hop. And they were like, you need to write something. And I was like, no, I'm talking about immigration and no one wants to hear about hip hop. And so at some point I said, well, wait a minute. Hip hop is a legitimate field of inquiry in the academy. African studies as a discipline really didn't recognize it as such until really like Yenamar happened and they saw the influence that rap had on politics. That's when they were like, oh, wait a minute, you know, there's something here. So I was kind of worried that I wouldn't get a job. No one would take me seriously. And so, but then I was like, you know, kind of follow that passion and I was really interested in it. And so having friends who were artists really encouraged me to write because writing from the writing that was coming out were people who were not from within the culture, who didn't know the culture. And they were writing like, oh, isn't it interesting? These, you know, these youth are doing or imitating Americans. And there was a lot they weren't getting. And so that's what made me do it. And then there were some scholars out of Cape Town, South Africa. They were doing some amazing work on hip hop in South Africa. So they also influenced me as well.
Thank you. Wonderful.
I also had one last question. I'm so sorry, Dr.
On behalf
No, right. Somebody
Yeah,
else
another
that
question.
Dr. Clark has a question.
Oh, Dr. Clark, it's really nice to meet you and thank you for your presentation. My question just kind of speaks to some other questions that were in the commentary. And what I wanted to know, does the music that you're studying, do some of the artists speak to the tensions that there are today between African Americans and Africans? Because there's lots of tension between our communities, I see still. And in connection kind of with that question, do you think that music and really letting African rap shine or come out in the United States, could that be one of the unifying factors? Because, you know, throughout history, music has been used to bring us together, right? To bring the diaspora together to see that we have similar stories.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I definitely do. I've always thought that hip hop would be a wonderful vehicle for Pan-Africanism. You know, I think that for a lot of African artists, they already see that, like, you really can't be an African hip hop artist and not like African Americans. Many of them already see their connection to African American culture, and I think for many Africans or African Americans who have that social consciousness, they also see that connection. And you see some that are really actively doing stuff. I mean, there's Blitz Bazawule, or Blitz the Ambassador, is a Ghanaian hip hop artist who's very Pan-African. He actually directed the new Color Purple film, but he's done 5 hip hop records. I mean, he's very Pan-African. I met him and became a fan of him as an MC, but he is making a lot more, directing films and stuff. But he also was a creative director on Beyonce's Black is King project. So him going into that area, but also bringing his hip hop self into those spaces, is also bringing those connections together. And so I do see that happening more. As more people from the diaspora are going to Ghana, I'm seeing those connections happening there. I know, Kendrick Lamar did a thing in Rwanda, and he was also in Ghana connecting with artists there. So I'm seeing that happen. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think that is happening. And it is good to see. So there's a lot of potential there. And even with the Afro beats, with Burna Boy, he's doing a lot of stuff, a lot of positive stuff. And he also recognizes, his music has a little bit more depth than like the typical Afro beats music.
Thank you. And do you think, just looking into the future, with past movements and the civil rights movements and different movements of Blackness in the United States, it seemed as if a lot of them were looking towards Africa for something more traditional, like looking towards, the African garbs, or wanting the traditional medicines and wanting all of that. Do you think that it's going to be more like a shocker to a lot of African Americans who are searching for that identity in Africa, and then come to face with a very modern, right, with the past and the present existing in the same space? Do you think that's going to be enlightening for lots of African Americans, or more of a kind of like, wow, that's not what I was thinking I was going to get?
Yeah, it is. Especially, I'm seeing that with dance. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of traditional African American dance groups that look at like the Azonto and the Afrobeats dance, and they're like not quite on board. I'm like, that's African dance too. So I'm seeing that clash happening. But I'm also seeing, one of the good things I'm seeing is, like, when I look at African fashion, I mean, there are some really great designers. I have even had to, my ex-husband is Ghanaian, he's a designer, and he like had to reorient me to thinking about art and fashion. Like, I don't go to like the Ghanaian Art Center, which is like this massive art market. I don't go there to buy art. He's like, if you're gonna go to buy art, go to a gallery. If you're gonna buy fashion, buy it from a designer. And if you're gonna pay, $50, $75 for a dress from Macy's, why not pay that from, a boutique in Accra? So then I started going to, Accra Mall and getting, so I'm like, that's true. This is, So the idea that an African dress should cost $10,
Mhm.
but I'm going to pay $75 for. So I, rethinking how I see and value African fashion, I think is also something that, and how I value African art also is something that we should definitely start rethinking.
For my part, on behalf of the consortium, I would like
Raj,
to
there's
thank
one
you.
more question from Moana.
Okay.
Sorry.
Go ahead,
Moana.
Kibona.
I just have a quick question about whether or not you see this work as an act of decolonization specifically. Do you teach that? Do you talk to your students about that? Or is it something that you see within? How do you see decolonization with this work?
So I'm honestly, like, I look at, in terms of decolonization, usually I'm approaching it from, in terms of looking at my methodology. So decolonizing African studies is something I take really seriously as an approach to my research. And so while I mentioned how I got into this study looking at, friendships with artists, when I look at my work and the value of my work in the academy, it's just as important that the academy values my work as the community values it. And so when I'm putting something out, I'm thinking of how it's going to be received in both places. And when I do like a case study and I'm interviewing artists, I don't see them as subjects, I see them as participants. And sometimes I will ask them, hey, this is my analysis of your work. What do you think? And, am I getting it right? Am I representing what you're saying properly? And I think that for me is about making sure I'm not speaking for them, but I'm giving them a platform, and that I am kind of being kind of that, and not a bridge, but I think part of the way that we as academics are trained is to go in and, kind of take the information and speak for communities. So part of my idea of decolonizing is understanding that there's getting rid of that hierarchy between, just because I have a certain letter behind my name doesn't make my views or what I have to say or the way I present knowledge any better than the way the artist presents knowledge or the knowledge the student has, necessarily. So that's kind of the way I try to break down some of those hierarchies so that we can, because I learn a lot from my students.
Well, I think, have we exhausted the questions from the attenders, from the attendees? Well, I think that we'll be able to have all the recordings and everybody will have recordings to that. But I would like to thank you, Dr. Clark, on behalf of the outreach directors who've actually sponsored this workshop. Thank you so much for a very enlightening presentation and for actually giving us also the resources that we need in terms of, reaching out to students. Your topic is really very important. It really cuts the bridge between Africa and African American studies. So that is very, very important. So thank you so much for being here this afternoon.
Is it okay if I jump in?
Yes, go ahead, Raj.
On behalf of the consortium, I would like to thank you. One of the goals in our project is to take students who are majoring in virtually any discipline and increase their knowledge, understanding, and awareness about different societies and their cultural, and in this particular case, the aspect of music. And to that extent, you made an immense and valuable contribution, and I would like to thank you on behalf of all member institutions of the consortium and other schools that have participated in this program. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Raj, you want to take it up from here?
No, I think everything is fine. I think we have had an excellent turnout.
Right.
If you take the people who attended more than one sessions. I have been counting some numbers. We are close to 90, 95. Now, but some people did not attend the morning session. Some people attended the afternoon session. Some people did not attend the second session in the afternoon, but they attended the first one, and so on and so forth. And I would like to thank each and every one of you for allowing us to reach this end. And I planned for this a little bit before the summer school started, and then I kind of worked with the registration. Thank you so much. I think we talked about pretty close to 50% of total registered people, and that's where we are.
And so we would like you to thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you to our presenters. First, they really, I think everybody did a fantastic job. Really, thank you so much. Everybody did, what we asked them to do, much more and beyond. So thank you to our presenters. But thank you to you, the participants, because without you, we would have no program. But we would also like to encourage you to do an evaluation of this program, because it's the evaluations that are extremely important for us, to be able to fund this kind of presentation. Let us know what you took from this and what actually we can do to make it better even. And we hope that next year, we always have this at the same time every year. We hope that you can come back this year too. So thank you so much for your participation. We really value it. And without you, like I said, there would be no program. So thanks a lot for being here.
Agnes, Lindsay, Elsa, and other people at the Harvard University, the two ladies, thank you very, very much for your support.
Elsa, you may have a few words to say. Go ahead.
I just want to reiterate what has been said already. You are all amazing for having been here and spent the day. I hope you walk away enriched and bringing all this amazing content to the classroom. The one word that always comes to me every time I participate or lead or co-organize is the word reverence. I'm always humbled about how much there is to know, and we are all in an ongoing journey to do so. So in reverence towards Africa and African studies and all the people that make up Africa and the diaspora. I wish you a wonderful weekend, and don't hesitate to reach out to all of us as National Resource Centers to be able to access more resources. And yes, many of you have asked about the recordings and the presentations, and we will share those as well. So we're in gratefulness and in community.
Don't close the chat box yet, just for 1 second. Let me cut and paste it, and we will be done. Just give me 1 second, please.
And when everybody else is done, I would like to ask Elsa, Lindsay, Brenda, Raj, and Vanessa to stay behind if you can for a few minutes.
Sure.
But remember, like our first presenter said, it's the community that it actually takes to actually raise a child. So we really value you as a community that comes through in terms of making education about Africa actually better, because it's as a community that we can do it. We can have all the resources, but that's nothing if we don't actually share it. So this is really about recentering Africa in the classroom. And I hope that, we can actually, just keep referring to that, because if we don't actually think about it, then we won't do anything. It's really a question of repositioning Africa in the classroom. We have to think about that all the time. So thank you again for being here.
Any other comments? Any other suggestions?